My name is Marcus Bennett, and at 72, I thought my life's great conflicts were already written, cataloged and closed, tucked neatly between the spines of the books that fill my library. I was wrong. The war I never expected began with a single sentence from my daughter. "Oh, we already had the engagement dinner yesterday, just close family." The words were calm, almost casual, but they landed like a verdict. She didn't know that I had already paid for every inch of that wedding, every deposit, every reservation, every flower arrangement. She also didn't know that the man she was about to marry had already appraised her life like a balance sheet. That night I sat in my library, the quiet heart of this old Philadelphia home surrounded by the scent of oak leather and the faint trace of my late wife Maggie's perfume that still clings to the curtains after all these years. My books have always been my refuge. Gibbon and Aurelius share these shelves with Baldwin and Dubois. Histories of empires that rose and fell, all echoing the same truth: power is lost the moment respect disappears. I thought of my daughter Emily, the girl who once sat cross-legged on this very floor, asking why kings fall and fathers fight. I used to tell her, because someone mistook kindness for weakness. Now I realize history had been preparing me for this. What I once studied as theory has come home as reality. Before I tell you what truly happened, how silence became my sharpest weapon in dignity, my last form of defense, please take a moment to tell me where you're listening from. And if you believe that family, like any great civilization, must be built on respect, not convenience, then I invite you to stay until the end of my story. My library has always been more than a room. It is a living archive of everything I value: discipline, patience, and the stories of people who built legacies from nothing but integrity. The walls are dark walnut, the shelves stretch from floor to ceiling, and every inch carries the quiet weight of human thought. On winter nights, the air holds that old perfume of paper lemon oil and the faint sweetness of Maggie's favorite lilies. Even after all these years, she's still here in the scent, in the silence, in the memory of how she used to place a cup of tea beside me and whisper, "Marcus, history is a mirror. Never stop looking." That evening, I found myself doing what I had done thousands of times before, sitting at my desk under the soft green light of my banker's lamp, restoring old photographs for the Bennett family archive. In my hands was a picture of my grandfather taken in the 1920s. He stood proudly in front of the small barber shop he had built with his own two hands. That photograph was to be part of a gift for my daughter Emily's wedding, a leather-bound album of our family story. It wasn't about money or luxury. It was a reminder of where she came from, the strength and dignity she was born into. As I brushed a bit of dust from the photo, my eyes landed on a newer image: Emily on her university graduation day. Her smile was radiant, her future wide open. I remember thinking that she had inherited Maggie's warmth and my patience. But as I looked at that picture, another memory surfaced: the dinner when I first met William Davenport. He was all polish and precision, the perfect suit, the perfect teeth, the perfect watch. The kind of man who uses charm as camouflage. He shook my hand with a grip too firm, a little too eager to prove dominance. Throughout the meal, he talked not about love or shared dreams, but about asset optimization and market volatility. He treated conversation like a sales pitch. At one point, swirling a glass of wine that probably cost more than my first car, he said, "History's all about patterns, isn't it, Mr. Bennett, just like the market." He smiled, believing he'd found common ground, but his bridge was made of glass. He wasn't talking about legacy. He was talking about profit. Then came the line that made my stomach turn. With the right estate planning, Emily's inheritance could yield a much higher annual return. I remember looking across the table at my daughter. She was glowing, hanging on every word. She didn't hear what I heard: a predator assessing the market value of my life's work. To her, it was just a man planning their future. To me, it was a man pricing my daughter's worth in percentages. That night after they left, I sat here in the library with the lights off, listening to the old clock in the hallway tick like a metronome of history. I realized then that what stood before me wasn't just a careless suitor. It was an invasion disguised as love. Days later, I tried to warn Emily. I waited until a quiet afternoon when the sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, the same place where Maggie once grew orchids that bloomed even in the dead of winter. Emily was humming as she made tea. For a moment, she was my little girl again, curious kind, completely unguarded. "Emily," I began, careful to keep my tone soft. This man, William, he speaks more about your future finances than about you. When a man measures love in numbers, he's not investing in your heart. He's speculating on your assets. She smiled, politely sat down and patted my hand, like one would a kindly old man who's lost touch with the world. Oh, Dad, she said you're old-fashioned. It's not like that. William just thinks practically. That's how people are now. That sentence, that's how people are now, was the true betrayal. It wasn't just that she didn't believe me. It was that she had already chosen his world over mine. I didn't argue. A historian knows you cannot teach a lesson before the student is ready. I simply nodded, pretending to agree, and let her think she'd won. But inside, I felt something shift. It was the quiet breaking of a bond that had taken a lifetime to build. A week later, I overheard her on the phone. She was laughing, speaking to William about finding a venue worthy of the Davenport name. Not the Bennett name, his name. My hand froze on the old grandfather clock I was polishing. The rhythmic ticking turned into a countdown. My daughter had become fluent in another man's language, a language of power, of image of acquisition. That night I walked back into my library and looked up at the portraits of my family men and women who had lived humbly but honorably. I made a silent promise to them and to Maggie. I would not allow the Bennett legacy to be swallowed by greed, because every historian knows when invaders rewrite your story, your silence decides who wins. And I, Marcus Bennett, had been silent long enough. The next morning the rain had stopped, but the house still smelled faintly of thunder. I stood at the window of my library watching the light fall across the garden Maggie once tended. The orchids were long gone, but the soil still carried her discipline, every plant neatly aligned, no chaos tolerated. She used to say, "Order, Marcus, is how love protects itself." That phrase kept echoing in my mind as I reviewed the notes I had taken after that dinner with William Davenport. A historian's instinct is not to react, but to record, to gather facts before forming judgment. Yet the facts, even in their gentlest form, were damning. Every gesture, every word he spoke carried the unmistakable tone of someone measuring opportunity, not affection. That afternoon I made tea in the same porcelain cups Maggie had loved and waited for Emily to visit. She came cheerful and radiant, a diamond flashing on her hand. When she said he asked and I said yes, I smiled like any father would. I congratulated her, complimented the ring, even though I knew Maggie would have called it vulgar. She always believed elegance whispered, never shouted. Later, as we sat in the living room, I asked her a simple question. Will there be an engagement party? Her smile faltered. For a moment the mask slipped, and I saw the flicker of hesitation in her eyes. Oh, of course, she said too quickly. William's parents are arranging something intimate. We'll let you know once it's finalized. We'll let you know. The words were polite, but I knew their meaning. I was no longer part of the circle. I had been placed politely, efficiently outside the gates. A historian recognizes a pattern when he sees one. Empires fall the same way families fracture. First you are not consulted, then you are not informed, finally you are not needed. A week passed in silence. Then on a Saturday morning, I opened my tablet to check the news and saw the photograph. The image that ended my patience. It was taken at the Fairmount Park Hunt Club, a place dripping with the self-importance of old money. There stood my daughter, radiant in a champagne-colored dress, her smile stretched too wide, her hand resting on William's arm, as if she were presenting him to the world. The caption read, "A magical evening celebrating the engagement of William Davenport and the lovely Emily Bennett. A gathering of their nearest and dearest family and friends." Nearest and dearest. The phrase struck like ice water. The people in the background were not strangers. They were my colleagues, my friends, people from Maggie's dental practice, the dean of the university where I had taught for 40 years. Everyone but me. It wasn't a simple oversight, it was a message. The historian in me understood exactly what it meant. This was the first act of a quiet coup. The old king had been removed from the narrative. The new dynasty had begun. I remember sitting perfectly still, the world outside my window dimming to gray. There was no rage, only humiliation, so sharp it felt clean. It wasn't just exclusion, it was erasure. I stared at that photo for a long time. Then in a slow, deliberate motion, I closed my tablet, placed it on the desk, and whispered to myself, "Very well." The silence that followed was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of strategy. That evening, I went to the shelf and pulled down a volume of Marcus Aurelius' His Meditations. The irony of our shared name was not lost on me. The Roman emperor had written, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." But Aurelius had also been a strategist. He knew when mercy became indulgence. I decided that night that my mercy had reached its limit. Behind that same book was a small hidden keypad, something Maggie and I had installed decades ago, not for secrets but for safekeeping. I entered a date only we knew the day we finished paying off our first house. With a soft click, a panel in the bookshelf opened to reveal a heavy gray safe. Inside lay the sum of our life's work stock, certificates, deeds, and one thick, leather-bound portfolio embossed in gold with the words, "The Bennett Family Trust." I carried it to the desk and opened it under the lamp's warm light. The legal language was dense, precise, but to me it read like a story, a map of our sacrifices and Maggie's foresight. She had been the one to insist on the trust. I'd wanted something simpler, but she had said, "Marcus, we're not protecting money. We're protecting values, and now those values were under siege." I spent hours reading through every clause. The trust owned everything: the house, our investments, even the account that funded Emily's education, and until recently, her lifestyle. There was one account in particular, a special disbursement fund linked to an American Express Centurion card. We'd given it to her when she graduated from her master's program. It was meant as a gift of freedom, not a blank check. Over the years, she had come to believe it was hers. She bragged about it to William, no doubt describing it as her black card. What she didn't know was that the card drew directly from the trust, and I was the sole trustee. It dawned on me then, the very key they used to build their illusion of wealth was the same key I could turn to dismantle it. That night I didn't sleep. I outlined my plan with the precision of a general preparing for a siege. Step 1, contact Evelyn Carter, Maggie's oldest friend and the lawyer who had co-authored the trust. Step 2, verify my legal rights. Step 3, quietly pull the lever that would stop their empire before it was built. The following morning, I drove to Evelyn's office, a modest stone building surrounded by trees, the kind of place where the law still smelled like oak and coffee, not glass and ambition. She greeted me not as a client, but as an old friend. "Marcus," she said, "you sound resolute. Tell me what's happened." I handed her my tablet. She looked at the photo, then at me and sighed. Maggie always worried this day might come. We talked for hours. I told her everything from William's manipulative charm to Emily's dismissive tone. Evelyn listened quietly, occasionally taking notes. Then she leaned back and said, "You're still the trustee, Marcus. The shield Maggie built is still in your hands." I nodded. "Then it's time I use it." Evelyn's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. "You're protecting your daughter, not punishing her." "I know," I said, "but sometimes love must draw blood to heal." She pulled out the trust document from her files and flipped through the pages until she reached the section on discretionary funds. "We can add a clause," she said. "A spending threshold, say $5,000. Anything above that requires your written notarized consent." I exhaled slowly. It was surgical, not vindictive. A measured strike aimed at the heart of excess. "And the Centurion card," she asked. "Freeze it," I said. "Immediately." She nodded and began drafting the amendment. Her pen moved steadily, the sound of ink scratching across paper like the ticking of a clock counting down to justice. When she finished, she placed the papers in front of me. "Are you certain, Marcus?" I looked at the old photograph of Maggie on her desk, smiling steady-wise. "Yes," I said, "more than I've ever been." I signed my name with a clear, unwavering hand. The ink bled slightly into the paper, permanent, irreversible. As the notary stamp fell with a heavy click, I felt something lift inside me, not joy, not triumph, but peace. History had just recorded a new chapter. And in this one, I was no longer the forgotten old man. I was the historian who had finally picked up his pen and reclaimed his story. The following days passed in deliberate stillness, like the hush before a storm. I returned to my routines: morning coffee in the garden, quiet afternoons in the library, evenings reading under the soft hum of the old lamp. But everything felt heavier, suspended in waiting. The amendment was filed, the bank notified, the Centurion card disabled. The machine of my plan was now alive, invisible and inevitable. I knew what was coming. A man like William Davenport, one whose life depends on illusion, doesn't survive a sudden confrontation with reality. The moment that card was declined, his carefully constructed empire of charm and arrogance would collapse. And as for Emily, I prayed the fall would break the spell before it broke her. 3 days later, the storm arrived exactly as predicted. While I sat at my desk, the rain tapping lightly against the window, they were across town at the Bellevue Hotel, meeting with one of the most exclusive wedding planners in Philadelphia. Ms. Sinclair, a woman whose floral arrangements could cost more than a year's salary for an ordinary family. I wasn't there, of course, but later I would hear every detail. It would become the story whispered through every corner of their social circle the moment the Davenport's golden image cracked. William had been in his element, charming and boastful, pointing out chandeliers and rearranging table placements like a self-appointed king. No lilies, he would say, orchids only. Thousands of them. Price doesn't matter. Emily had laughed, dazzled by his confidence, unaware she was standing on a trapdoor. When the planner presented the final estimate, a staggering figure enough to buy a modest home, William smiled as if this were nothing. "We'll take it," he said smoothly and reached into his jacket. The black centurion card gleamed between his fingers like a trophy. Miss Sinclair took. It swiped and paused. A faint beep, a red light. "Strange," she murmured, forcing a professional smile. "These machines can be fickle." William laughed loudly, that brittle performative kind of laughter meant to assert control. "Try again," he said, waving it off. "There's no limit on that card." She tried again. The same soft beep, the same small, devastating red light. The air changed. Emily frowned. "That's impossible," she said. "There must be a mistake." Miss Hugh Sinclair lowered her voice. "Perhaps you should call the bank." William's expression hardened, the first cracks showing through his confidence. "Go on, Emily," he whispered sharply. "Fix it." She stepped aside, phone in hand, her voice sharp with irritation. I could almost hear her tone in my imagination, the same dismissive impatience she'd once used with me. But as the minutes passed, that tone began to crumble. "What do you mean suspended?" I could picture her saying, her voice dropping, the color draining from her face. "By who?" A pause, a whisper. "My father." And then silence. When she turned back, the confidence was gone. The sparkle had vanished from her eyes. William's smile had curdled into rage. Ms. Sinclair, ever professional, simply closed her binder and said softly, "Perhaps we can reconvene once your finances are in order." The meeting ended there, not with an explosion, but with the quiet dignity of doors closing on a dream. That evening, my phone rang. The name Emily flashed across the screen. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Dad," her voice was frantic, trembling with anger and humiliation. "Something's wrong with the card. You have to fix it right now." They declined it in front of everyone. Behind her, I could hear William shouting instructions, his composure entirely gone. "Emily," I said evenly. "I didn't forget to pay the bill." There was silence. Pure, disbelieving silence. What she stammered. "Then what happened?" "It wasn't an accident," I replied quietly. "It was a decision." Her breathing quickened. "A decision? Dad, what are you talking about?" I let a pause stretch between us, the kind that demands truth to fill it. Then I said, "I warned you what happens when you trust a man who values your ledger more than your heart." The only sound after that was her breath catching the distant, muffled voice of William, demanding to know what I had said. "Why would you do this to me?" she whispered finally. "This is my wedding. You're ruining everything." "No," I said. "I'm saving you from ruin." The next morning at precisely 10 o'clock, I heard the doorbell. They arrived together. Emily's eyes were red, her face pale and drawn. William followed behind her, still trying to wear authority like a well-tailored suit, but failing. I received them in my library. Evelyn Carter sat quietly by the fireplace as witness. Without a word, I slid a folder across the desk toward Emily. "Before we speak," I said, "you should read this." She hesitated. William hissed, "Don't." "He has no right." I ignored him. "You have every right to the truth, Emily." Her hands trembled as she opened the folder. Page by page, the illusion fell apart. Credit card debt, unpaid loans, a failing consultancy, a lawsuit. Everything William had built was a house of cards, and the foundation had just turned to dust. When she looked up, the devastation in her eyes was almost unbearable. The man beside you, I said softly, is drowning, and you were his lifeline. William rose furious. You can't interfere in her life. She's an adult, then she can make an adult choice, I replied, but she'll do it with open eyes. I turned to Emily. My daughter, the father who raised you, sits here. The man who's loved you, protected you, and taught you everything he knows about integrity. The choice before you is simple: him and a life built on lies, or me and a future built on truth. The room fell into a silence so thick it seemed to absorb the light. She didn't answer. She simply closed the folder, stood slowly, and walked out. William followed, cursing under his breath. When the door closed, the library returned to its familiar calm. The only sound was the steady tick of the clock, a historian's heartbeat. 3 months later, spring came early. Emily returned one quiet afternoon. No makeup, no diamond ring. She didn't apologize. I didn't ask her to. We sat at the table where Maggie once grew her orchids. I brought out the family album, the one I had made for her wedding. We turned the pages together, father and daughter, tracing our lineage with fingertips that finally rested in the same rhythm. At last, she looked at me and whispered, "You tried to tell me." I nodded. "And you had to see it yourself." In that moment, something fragile and real settled between us: respect. I understood then what Maggie had meant all those years ago. Love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's charity disguised as devotion. And when you let others mistake your kindness for weakness, they will always test how far they can push before you break. But the truth is, I didn't break. I rebuilt. So to anyone listening, remember this. Respect is the invisible currency of family. It cannot be inherited or bought. It must be earned again and again. True wealth isn't found in trust funds or black cards, but in the trust you build with those who value you, not what you provide. When you draw a boundary out of love, you aren't being cruel. You are teaching others the cost of forgetting who you are. I am Marcus Bennett, and this was the most important history lesson I ever had to write. The days after that conversation were filled with a silence unlike any I had known. It wasn't the silence of loneliness anymore. It was the silence of peace, the kind that settles after a long, hard-fought battle you didn't want but couldn't avoid. I would often find myself standing in the doorway of my library, the morning sun stretching across the shelves, touching the spines of books that had outlasted entire empires. I would think of Maggie and whisper, "We did it." Emily began visiting on Sundays. The first few times she brought nothing but an awkward quiet, as if afraid that one wrong word might reopen the wound. We didn't talk about William. We didn't have to. In time, her eyes softened again, the arrogance replaced by humility, and the distance replaced by gratitude. One afternoon, she arrived carrying a small cardboard box. "I thought you should have these back," she said. Inside were the remnants of her short-lived engagement, a few expensive trinkets, the invitation proofs, the contract with Miss Sinclair, all paid deposits refunded in full. It wasn't an apology in words, but it was in action, and that was enough. I told her Maggie would be proud of you. She smiled faintly. I'm starting to understand what she meant about love not being a transaction. We sat together for hours that day. I showed her the final pages of the album, the ones I hadn't finished before the chaos began. Photos of her as a child in the garden, of Maggie painting in the sunlight, of us on the porch the day she left for college. These, I told her, are the dividends that matter. In the evenings, I sometimes took slow walks through the neighborhood, nodding to old friends who still called me Professor Bennett. A few of them had seen the social media storm that followed the wedding's cancellation, but no one asked questions. They simply offered quiet respect, the kind you can't buy, only earn through the way you carry your silence. One night, as the sky burned orange over the city, I realized something I had spent my entire career studying: the collapse of civilizations, and yet I had lived long enough to prevent the fall of my own. The Bennett legacy had survived not because of wealth, but because of principle. Evelyn stopped by the following week with new trust documents for my review. We sat by the fireplace while she signed the last set of papers. "It's all in order," she said. "The trust is stronger than ever. Emily will inherit it when the time comes, but this time she'll understand what it represents." I nodded. She's learning the same lesson we all do eventually. The true cost of freedom is accountability. Evelyn smiled. Maggie would have liked that. Before she left, she paused at the door. "Marcus," she said softly, "you didn't just save your daughter's inheritance, You saved her from living a life owned by someone else." Her words stayed with me long after she was gone. That night, I sat alone at my desk, pen in hand, and began writing a letter not for Emily now, but for the next generation. It began simply, "To my grandchildren, should you ever read this, remember that the truest measure of wealth is not how much you possess, but how much you can walk away from without losing yourself." I sealed it and tucked it inside the Bennett family trust portfolio, between the deeds and legal papers. Some lessons, after all, must outlive the teacher. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway, steady as ever. I thought of the first time I'd held Emily as a newborn, how tiny her hands were, how fragile her heartbeat had felt against my chest. The same child who once asked why kings fall had now learned what it means to rebuild a kingdom, one grounded in respect, not gold. Months later, when Emily invited me to dinner at her apartment, I accepted without hesitation. The table was modest, the food simple: roasted chicken, a bottle of inexpensive wine, laughter echoing through a small space that finally felt real. When I stood to leave, she hugged me longer than she had in years. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for saving me from the life I thought I wanted." I rested a hand on her shoulder. "I didn't save you, Emily. You did that yourself. I just turned off the music so you could hear the truth." As I walked home that night, I felt the city breathing around me, ordinary, imperfect, alive. And I realized that justice, in the quiet form it takes for men like me, doesn't arrive with applause or vengeance. It arrives as peace. Now, when I sit in my library and open that album, I no longer see what was lost. I see what was preserved: a lineage, a lesson, a love, strong enough to draw a boundary and still forgive. History will remember the great wars, the conquests, the kings who fell. But the wars fought inside homes, the battles for integrity, the quiet acts of courage, those are the stories worth retelling. So if you're listening to this now, wherever you are, let this be your reminder: every family is a civilization, and respect is its law. Guard it fiercely, because the moment you allow greed or vanity to rewrite that law, the empire begins to crumble. I am Marcus Bennett, historian, father, and keeper of the line. And this time, the story did not end with conquest. It ended with clarity. And in that clarity, I found peace. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a quiet transformation in my daughter that no speech or lecture could have achieved. The anger that had once burned behind her words was gone, replaced by a kind of steady gentleness I hadn't seen since she was a child. She began helping at the community center on weekends, volunteering to teach financial literacy classes. I thought it was time I learned how the system actually works. She told me one Sunday over tea, her smile faint but real. I didn't say much. Sometimes the greatest proof of understanding is in what is no longer said. The trust between us, once fractured, had become something stronger, quieter, and truer. She no longer needed my approval, and I no longer needed her apology. What bound us now was not guilt, but respect born of pain, of awakening, of choice. One morning I found a letter on my doorstep. It was from Mrs. Sinclair, the wedding planner. Inside was a brief handwritten note: "Mr. Bennett, I wanted to thank you. You may not realize it, but what you did likely saved your daughter from years of unhappiness. I've seen too many families collapse under the weight of appearances. You chose dignity over spectacle. That's rare." I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the back of the family album between two blank pages. Every story, after all, needs a reminder of when the ending began to heal. Later that afternoon, Evelyn Carter stopped by with her usual calm smile. "You're trending online, you know," she said, setting a newspaper on the table. "Word got out about the Davenport's engagement collapsing. Seems everyone has an opinion." I looked at the headline, something melodramatic about a Philadelphia heiress's wedding scandal, and laughed softly. "Let them talk," I said. "History has always belonged to the loudest for a while, but the truth, it waits, and it endures." Evelyn smiled knowingly, spoken like a man who's been teaching history his whole life. That evening, as the sunset spilled gold across my desk, I opened Maggie's old journal. Between her recipes and notes on patience, I found a page written years before she passed. "If Marcus ever doubts himself, remind him that silence is not surrender. It's wisdom choosing its moment." I closed the book, feeling her voice like a steady pulse beside me. Everything I had done, the amendments, the confrontation, the restraint, had been guided by her unseen hand. Weeks turned into months and life settled into a rhythm. Emily began visiting, not out of guilt, but genuine affection. We cooked together, laughed about small things, and even argued once or twice, the good kind of argument, the kind that ends with both people smiling. One Sunday morning, she handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a fountain pen, simple black engraved with my initials. "For your next book," she said. I looked at her amused. "You think there's still another book in me?" "There's always another story, Dad," she said softly, "especially when you've lived through one worth telling." And she was right. I began to write not a history of nations or wars, but of a family. My family. A record of how love can fracture and mend, how power can corrupt even the gentle, and how silence, when used wisely, can restore what anger destroys. I wrote late into the nights, often pausing to glance at the photo of Maggie on my desk. I could almost hear her teasing voice. "Make sure the ending gives them hope, Marcus." By the time I finished, the seasons had changed again. The first snow had arrived, blanketing the garden in white. I stood at the window with a cup of coffee, watching flakes drift against the dark wood of the fence. Everything felt quiet, honest, and new. When Emily visited that evening, she noticed the stack of pages, bound neatly with twine. "What's this?" she asked. "Our history," I said. "The lesson of the Bennett family." She picked up the pages, reading the first line aloud. "Respect is the invisible currency of family." Her eyes shimmered. "That's beautiful," she whispered. I smiled. "It's true." She set the manuscript down and looked around the library. "You know," she said, "I used to think this room was full of ghosts. All these books about people long gone. But now I see it's full of lives that mattered." I nodded slowly. That's all we can ever hope for Emily to matter. She walked over and hugged me tightly, the kind of embrace that needs no words. For the first time in a long time, I felt the full circle of life's quiet redemption. So if you've listened this far wherever you are, I ask you one thing. Look at your own life, your own family. Ask yourself, have you built your home on respect or on convenience? Have you loved to nurture, or have you loved to control? Because love without respect is dependency dressed as devotion, and respect without love is just distance pretending to be peace. If my story has taught you anything, let it be this. Sometimes the greatest act of love is to stop enabling someone else's illusion and to let them face the truth you tried to spare them from. My name is Marcus Bennett, and I am not a rich man by modern standards, but I am wealthy in the ways that matter, in peace and memory, in the daughter who finally found her way home. The war for my family's soul is over, and though the battlefield is quiet now, I still hear Maggie's voice in the echo of every heartbeat. Order Marcus is how love protects itself. I smile, close the album, and switch off the lamp. Outside, the snow continues to fall soft, silent, and endless, just like the respect that rebuilt everything we almost lost.